This is the Cloud Ace podcast, bringing you the latest in cloud security through captivating chats with fascinating cybersecurity experts who are leaving their mark on the industry. Cloud Ace is brought to you by the SANS Institute and hosted by SANS certified instructor Brandon Evans. And now, prepare for departure. We are cleared for takeoff. Here's your captain, Brandon Evans.
Today, I have the pleasure of talking to John Alves. He is a manager and a Microsoft Services principal at CyberOne Security, a security consulting firm and product reseller. John spends most of his time working in Microsoft Azure and the Microsoft 365 suite. He has 3 GX certifications, countless Microsoft certifications, and much more. John and I met when he was my facilitator for my course, SEC510, Public Cloud Security, AWS, Azure, and GCP at the Cyber Defense Initiative in 2021. He absolutely crushed the course, winning first place in our class Net Wars competition and obtaining the coveted SEC510 challenge coin. It is no surprise that from there, John started TAing for the course. Now, I am so happy to see him start his journey to become a SANS instructor and teach 510. He even plans on contributing some additional content to the course. I'll cut this intro short so that he can get back to working on that as soon as we're done here. So welcome, John.
Hey, thanks, Brandon. It's awesome to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to ask you the same question that I ask most of our guests. How did you get involved with the cloud? How did that experience differ from what you were used to on-prem? And what led you to the career that you have today?
So that's kind of an interesting one. I pretty much fell into it. I was working as a senior network engineer and security lead for a retail company back in, I want to say, 2017. And I actually had met with Critical Start, which was originally the parent company of CyberOne. We spun off CyberOne. And from there, we went into, hey, we're looking for a position. And I ended up filling a resident engineer role for one of their customers, which ended up being SoftLayer, now IBM Cloud. So I was doing application whitelisting, systems administration, Linux, but for the cloud backend. And that's where I really got my foothold into it. And when that contract got done and I came back, they're like, what do you want to do? And I'm like, I don't know. And they were like, we're starting this practice. We're doing this for cloud. Want to have at it? And I said, yes. And it just took off from there. Really enjoyed it. From a difference perspective, I can do it anywhere. I don't have to worry about going into a data center. I think that is, although on hot days going into the data center, that was nice. I don't miss having to go rack mount, work on systems, work on network, right? Let somebody else do that. Working with the cloud, I can be anywhere and help anybody anywhere.
That's such a obvious point that I don't think people really mention that often, is that when you're an actual network engineer working in a data center, if there's an outage or an incident, you literally have to go there to deal with the issue. And now you can do this work anywhere. That's awesome. And I'm sure it would have been nightmarish to do data center work really during the pandemic.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I was very fortunate to be in this role. I mean, I was being in the cloud didn't really affect my employment or, the kind of work coming through. We actually got busier as companies started looking at, how are we going to enable our workforce to be a remote workforce? And, they started reaching out to us to help guide them on that new concept that, they went from being this old way of thinking of every employee has to come in and has to work from the office to I need to continue to bring in revenue, but the pandemic is not enabling me to do that unless I enable my employees to go remote. And that really, I think we got even busier through the pandemic.
Absolutely. A lot of things had to change in order to enable work in that time period. And I'm sure that there was a lot of work from a security perspective as well, because now you have to worry about your data being exposed on networks that you do not directly have control to unless you're, working with a VPN solution. Now, a lot of people that come from a networking background, I feel like the transition from on-prem to the cloud is quite difficult because they are used to solving problems with network solutions, right? When you have all you have is a hammer, you're going to see everything as a nail. And a lot of traditional network security folks say, okay, we got our firewall rules, and that's going to be enough to protect us in the cloud. So what's your perspective on that? What helped you change the way that you thought about security within the cloud versus on-prem?
See, for me, I don't think I had that issue. And one of the biggest reasons for that is while I was a senior network engineer, I was also the security lead. So I was dealing with endpoint protection solutions, DNS filtering solutions, email security. So I was covering a lot of other facets of the security stack within the company, as opposed to just being that network person. Now, I do see where for some individuals, even as I teach some of the Microsoft certifications, where when they start hitting these certain concepts, they're thinking, well, can I not just create a single rule to block it? Well, that's not kind of how it works because you don't manage that part of the network, right? That is now, when we start talking about that responsibility model for cloud, that's not your responsibility anymore. You're working in IaaS, well, the back end, how it communicates, you're hitting a public endpoint for those. And I think that I was able to grasp it easier because I had a broad experience across different stacks within the security tool set than just network.
Got it. And it's awesome that you've been able to translate those concepts pretty well from having that experience. A lot of people who just have that network experience don't really think about things like IAM and identity and access management, as well as authentication and authorization. If you do a little bit of studying in security, those concepts are really hard to ignore.
No, definitely.
Yeah. So you have a lot of experience with all three of the cloud providers, but your main area of interest and focus is definitely Microsoft Azure, and you have just so much knowledge in that area. I find myself learning about Azure when I talk to you myself, even though I wrote the course on public cloud security here at SANS. So when compared to the other big cloud providers, what stands out to you about Azure? What approaches do they take that are fundamentally different from the other two providers?
I mean, and I've dealt with AWS, I've dealt with Azure, and I think one of the key things is the user interface to me makes it a little bit user friendly. And I might just be biased. I mean, I know I'm the Microsoft guy here, but I personally think that when it comes to learning the two, it's a little bit user friendly when it comes to navigation, being able to understand what everything is. And the names mean what they mean versus what's an S3, versus what is a storage account, right? It makes it a little user friendly, I think. That's the biggest thing that stood out to me. For the most part, it really comes down on use case and where your company's currently at to decide, where they're going to go. And to me, it really just comes down to a business use case. I don't have a preference one over the other. I just do like the user interface for Azure. I think it's easier to learn and understand.
You're probably one of the only people on the planet that feel that way. A lot of people think that Azure's user interface is really difficult to work with. In fairness, it's gotten a lot better. But when you compare like 2006 AWS versus 2006 Azure, I don't even think it's a question. But what I definitely do agree with is that the naming conventions are so much better. And there's that article that I bring up in class a lot that you've probably laughed at a bunch of times. The AWS in plain English document, which helps you translate AWS services to reasonably titled service names. Like S3 is Amazon FTP server, which is an oversimplification, but it makes it a lot easier to understand what's going on than, hey, what the heck is Glacier?
Right. And when I first learned what Glacier was, and I think I hadn't actually heard of Glacier until class last year when we were doing it, you went over it. I'm like, what is that? And then you gave us the form, and I'm like, oh, hey, light bulb. But yeah, I might be the only one. Another thing is it's a little easier to track and remove resources. One thing I hate, especially, and I've experienced this in multiple of our classes, is when certain people have issues, tearing stuff down. it's way easier when you can just go ahead and delete a resource group than having to jump around to delete resources.
Yeah, I think inventory management is significantly better in both Azure and GCP, where you can have all your inventory in one resource group in Azure and one project in GCP. And by the way, for those who are following at home regarding Glacier, the AWS in plain English document defines Amazon Glacier as Amazon really slow S3. So it's your cold storage solution. It's kind of just a slower S3. But you mentioned earlier about the business use cases. Can you delve into a little bit more details about what use cases would lead you towards using Azure versus AWS? Can you dive into a little bit more detail there?
Yeah, not a problem. So one of the things that Microsoft has done is position themselves very well within an enterprise. When you talk about an identity provider for a company, right? So we mentioned IAM, we mentioned authentication. So users have to be assigned some sort of user account. Well, that's the identity provider that handles that. And more often than not, it's going to be Active Directory when we're talking about companies that are already on-prem. And then if they're either startups or hybrid, they're working both Active Directory and Azure Active Directory or just Azure. So positioning yourself within the market to be the identity provider, positioning yourself with these E licenses, A licenses, G licenses, which by the way are extremely convoluted as to what they include. But you're looking at, I have my Microsoft Office apps, it's included in this. I have some sort of management included. And now you're looking at, well, how do I get certain products that I need, whether it's on the 365 ecosystem, I'm looking for endpoint protection. Well, I already have Microsoft. So now if we go into the cloud and I'm trying to migrate into the cloud and and I'm a Microsoft shop, just because that's what we've all been taught to have Windows servers to, stand up Active Directory. The simplest idea is to go, migrate there. So one of the use cases I've seen is when a company has a large server farm for terminal services, right? So remote desktop services, thin clients connecting in and doing virtual desktops. And now you're looking at Azure Virtual Desktop. That's one of the biggest ones. We've seen quite a bit of migration into that side of things. We've seen SIMs now. So if you don't have a cloud presence, but now you're looking at cloud SIM, well, one of the biggest ones in the market right now that has a huge push is Microsoft Sentinel. And that's actually one of the things I work on the most. And what majority of my projects end up being is the Microsoft Sentinel tool set. So those are two key things that I've seen a lot of migration to. Now, when it comes to developing apps, it really comes down to the developers themselves. I see a lot more apps in AWS, right? Whenever I talk to companies that are already in the cloud, they might have multi-cloud. Most of their app presence is in AWS, but they now have to have Azure Cloud because, like I said, maybe they're looking at the SIM. So that forces them to go Azure Cloud versus AWS's or GCP's cloud.
So at a high level, would you say that if you are already familiar with securing Microsoft environments, that your transition to Azure would be a lot simpler than if you transition from a really heavily Linux environment to AWS?
I wouldn't say that it would be simpler. Securing your on-prem, as we know, isn't a one-to-one translation, whether it's Azure or AWS, right? The concepts are different. The way you do a network is different in the cloud, right? The tools that you have to do access control lists is different. When it comes to VM, the way that you secure a VM, unlike on-prem where the server itself is secured behind a data center in a cage and even some additional locks there. Well, now somebody can log in and now you have to really heavily think about role-based access control, IAM permissions. So it's not a one-to-one translation. I think that you can transition into any cloud. I just think that because you already have Microsoft, you tend to think, well, it makes it easy, especially for companies that have like enterprise level agreements. It's easy for them to say, well, I'm migrating this, and Microsoft's going to find some sort of way to comp or give credits to help persuade to go that route.
Got it. So a very significant portion of that is just getting more support from Microsoft when you're already a big Microsoft shop.
Yep.
That explains why Microsoft support folks seem to be so busy. They're helping out the people that are already giving the money versus the people trying to break into their platform from scratch. But I'm not going to rant about that too much.
No, but that's where partners come into play. Microsoft has this whole thing where unless you're really, and this is just from experience, unless you're really one of those Fortune 100, right? Or you have these large multi-billion dollar deals, they rely heavily on Microsoft partners. So us, CyberOne, we're a Microsoft partner. So we have that expertise. Sometimes I feel like we have more expertise than some of the support groups within Microsoft. And that's just from speaking with customers that have had to deal with certain teams in Microsoft. And that's not a hit against Microsoft. I mean, such a large company that all these little teams are siloed.
Yeah, and I can definitely compliment you for your immense experience troubleshooting issues that I personally have faced with regards to Azure. So I'm very happy to have a direct line to you for most things related to Azure. But just to get into the details regarding IAM and Azure a little bit more, you mentioned Active Directory, and then there's obviously Azure Active Directory, and people tend to think this is fundamentally the same service. How do you respond to that?
Azure Active Directory is flat. So while you think of a hierarchy with Active Directory domain services, you think a tree. That's how you should think about it. When you think of Azure Active Directory, it's flat land. So it's completely different. It's all based off of, while you might think about objects and groups, it's all security groups and permissions. And you can assign them individually, you can assign them in groups, but it's flat across the board. The way it authenticates, it's completely different. Now, if you have a hybrid, now we're getting into some complex things, but apples to apples, no. Tree, flat.
Sure. I mean, let's get into a little bit of those details. What about those hybrid environments marry these two technologies together?
So you have Azure AD Connect. This is the utility that will go ahead and synchronize from your on-prem into Azure AD. Now, you don't have to sync everything. You sync what you want. So, of course, if you have on-prem admin accounts, you're not going to sync those up to your admin accounts in Azure. Just keep that separation, separate passwords, etc. But it will sync things based off of a key identifier, right, that is unique for each value, for each identity. And then this gives you, depending on the level of licensing that you have, here we go again with the licensing and Microsoft nickel and diming, right? But depending on the level of licensing, you might get some additional features such as password writeback. So what that means is if you're in Azure and you reset your password in Azure, it will go ahead and synchronize that back to your on-prem account so that when you go log into your laptop or your desktop, or maybe an on-prem application that syncs and uses uses Active Directory domain services, your password's there. It's the same, right? So that's one of those things that differs. You have to have certain licensing to do that. But then what about companies that already have federated services and they're using Microsoft Federation servers so that any type of authentication goes through the Federation server? So instead of going into, let's say, Azure AD and signing in there, you actually get redirected to your on-prem web-facing server where you authenticate. And now you're authenticating just like you would with normal Active Directory domain services. It utilizes Kerberos versus in the cloud, you're looking at OAuth, right?
Support for the Cloud Ace podcast comes from the SANS Institute. Major enterprises are now multi-cloud by choice or by chance. Vendor-specific training only covers one cloud provider at a time. SEC510 Public Cloud Security, AWS, Azure, and GCP is different. It explores the strengths and weaknesses of the big three cloud providers in depth, exposing insecure default configurations as well as inherent security issues that cannot be directly mitigated. By completing over 15 hands-on exercises that cover each major cloud provider equally, SEC510 students develop a deep understanding of the underlying design and implementation of the providers and their services in order to secure them appropriately. Continue your journey in cloud security by visiting sans.org/sec510. I look forward to having you in class. Got it. So you can connect those two environments together, and maybe they make it a little bit easier than the other providers do, at least within a Microsoft shop, but you're going to have to pay a lot extra in order to make that happen just because they put everything behind the premium label.
That is true, but the larger corporations, they already have licensing that includes this, right? You can already, even from a low licensing, you might not get password write back or some other capabilities, but you will get like pass the hash. So you might just be required to reset your password only on-prem or through a VPN as long as your laptop's connected to the VPN and can communicate with, your Active Directory domain services. But a lot of the times people don't even know that they have these capabilities because they just bought into the I need E3 or I need E5 because of maybe one or two tools like Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Office 365, which is email security, right? They just bought into one or the other and they don't understand that, I have licensing now in Azure for Azure AD that gives me additional capabilities to enable me to do, to have better synchronization between my on-prem and my cloud.
Got it. And yeah, Microsoft is very successful with its bundles. It tries to get you to stay in the ecosystem by giving a lot of things away for free. I could talk about that for a while, but I want to stay on topic. Definitely have been frustrated by that in the past. But I wanted to get to Azure Sentinel because you mentioned that you spend most of your time there. And honestly, I'm not a SIM expert by any means. And I also haven't really played around with Sentinel, but I keep hearing about it being like the best of breed in terms of cloud SIMs. Why is that? What does it bring to the table that, let's say, a CloudWatch or a Google Cloud Logging does not?
So I would say one of the biggest things is it can bring in any type of log. And I know that's a big statement, right? I can ingest anything. And really, I haven't found anything that I can ingest unless the limitation is actually on the source that I'm trying to bring in. So I'm only limited by what the source can do and provide me, but I can bring in anything. And the reason for that is because you can actually utilize logic apps, right? Which is like Azure Functions, but a graphical interface. And then you can utilize Azure Functions as well in order to, or even build your own application to ingest logs using the Microsoft Graph API. And just because of that API and its capabilities, I can bring in anything. And I can integrate with third-party tools like Cribble or other Logstash to normalize, manipulate my logs coming in before they reach it.
Talk to me a little bit more about Microsoft Graph for those who are not familiar with it. What kinds of data are in the Microsoft Graph API?
So Microsoft Graph API, as of the newest update, can provide you data and configuration access across your entire 365 Defender suite and even within Azure, such as Log Analytics, Sentinel, Azure Monitor.
Got it. I believe that it can interact with even Windows 10 data and maybe even Xbox Live data.
Actually, I believe the Xbox Live data, yes. I haven't delved into that as that's more on the, application development side for it.
Gotcha. So in comparison, you've worked with these other cloud providers' logging solutions. What are some of the gaps that are there? Because as mentioned before, I've worked with both of those solutions, but I'm not a defender. I'm more of a builder, an attacker, an architect. I've never really worked in incident response. And I know a lot of our audience does. So what kinds of gaps will they find in the other providers that Azure Sentinel fills?
So I think if you compare some of the other providers, and if you're looking at like even AWS, for instance, when we talk about class, we talk about the Cloud Trail, CloudWatch logs, and kind of how we query through, even when we query log analytics, you're at a CLI or you're just looking at the straight logs, but there's no platform built around it for detection. And then even when you look at other SIEMs, a lot of other SIEMs were, even from an on-prem, if we think about Splunk, it was more to operationalize your logs. Like when I was first introduced to Splunk, it was when I was a network engineer, and it was to track what we were doing on the network, not necessarily from a threat or detection standpoint. It was just your standard incident and event, but those incidents didn't necessarily mean that they were, malicious activity. It was more to track, the health of the environment. And so Sentinel provides free training. That's always a big one. A lot of these other ones, and I think that's another thing that Microsoft has an edge on some of the other ones, is the abundance of free training that they provide so that they get that adoption. That's one. The dashboarding and out of the box. So most of the other tools, you have to create your own detections. You have to create your own use cases. Well, Microsoft and the providers that connect into it. So if we think about, let's say, Palo Alto firewalls, there's a connector to bring that data in, and now there's detections built around it already out of the box that you can enable, instead of now, well, how do I have to learn KQL now? I have to go figure out how to build a query to now get an output that gives me the detection that I need around whatever use case it is. I don't have to do that anymore. I can just utilize the out of the box. Now, we still recommend going through those use cases and identifying what you really want to use, but that's one of the key things, I think.
So if I understand you properly, CloudWatch and Google Cloud Logging has the same foundational capabilities, the ability to track and query logs, but not a whole lot of the bells and whistles that are built on top of them, like automatic threat detection, having rule sets that can correlate data sets, and much more. You have to build those things out yourself.
Right. And then another differentiator is Sentinel is also a SOAR. So you get your orchestration, automation, response capabilities, and those utilize logic apps, which the logic apps can call Azure functions. They can utilize APIs for your data sources. So instead of having to go out and buy a SOAR, you can build your own SOAR use cases through Sentinel as well. Now that's a higher overhead because there are only a couple that are pre-built, and most of that requires you understanding it or utilizing a partner or consulting firm to do that for you.
Got it. Seems like it has a lot of different capabilities, and I'm glad that it does provide some free training for that service, because we all know the value of training. If folks on the call or listening to this podcast, if they didn't value training, they probably would not be in the SANS Cloud Ace podcast, because we all are trying to learn new technologies, and they're just not intuitive, especially when you have all those different capabilities and all of those different acronyms like SOAR, SIM, and it gets really complicated really quickly. But speaking of training and mentoring, you're kind of in a sweet spot right now in that you still are doing technical things, but you're also a manager. So I'm kind of curious about your experience managing cloud security engineers. What have you done to help your reports in their cloud journey? And what kinds of, places in their journey have you found them in?
So the number one thing is enabling them to grow professionally, from their skill sets to like hard skills, so the technical skills and soft skills. So one of the things we do, and that I personally love doing, is giving them a learning path, right? Here's let me know what your current skill set is. What are you interested in? What do you like? Because another thing is to excel in your, I would say, professional growth, but from a skill sets perspective, you have to enjoy what you're doing, right? And so, and I was actually just having this conversation today with leadership. We define a learning path based off of, where they come from. So what they already know, both from an on-prem, cloud, security, and then where we have gaps in skill sets or where we want to, add additional bodies, right, within this skill level or this technology, and then couple that with what they like, and then enable them to go learn, go do the training. We also teach internally. So I teach the Microsoft certifications internally, and then I enable them to teach it as well so that it solidifies their foundational knowledge. So if they can teach what they just learned, then they learned it, right? And that also helps them build the next person, right? I train them, they train the next one, and now we just build.
That's such an amazing point, is that you learn from teaching. I think a lot of people don't value how much you can learn from teaching. Sometimes people will come up to me after a SEC510 session and they'll be like, Brandon, how did you learn so much about AWS, Azure, and GCP? And I'll tell them, I have experience in those areas, but do you think that I knew all of the things that I now know today about those providers before I wrote the course and taught it like 20 different times? No, you learn a lot from developing materials as well as teaching those materials. A lot of people just say, oh, I understand it, but I can't explain it to you. It's too complicated. And whenever I meet someone like that, I'm like, this person does not understand this concept, because if they had full mastery over the concept, they'd be able to distill it down so that anybody can understand it, so that they're not hiding behind acronyms or jargon.
And another thing, when it comes to teaching, you're also going to learn from the people you're teaching, because depending on what level of skill they're at, they might have something that they bring to the table. A perfect example is the 510 class. It's across 3 different clouds. You wrote the course across all 3 clouds, right? But when we look at the class and the attendance, I was primarily Azure with lower knowledge or expertise on the other 2 clouds, whereas other individuals in the class were experts in the other clouds. And that allowed for some really good discussions and comparisons between the 2, where I learned a lot, not just about those clouds, but about the differences within the cloud that I'm an expert in and excel at. And that helps me as a principal, as a solutions architect, to better understand and better convey any messages I need to around the products and services within that cloud to my customers.
Absolutely. And it's so important to have some humility when you're in one of these classes or in the industry in general. I find myself learning stuff from my students all the time. And especially within the cloud, you just simply cannot know everything. One of my favorite things to discuss on day 1 of the class is we talk about the different issues that come about when we implement a multi-cloud strategy. And I talk about securing a single cloud. And I ask folks, hey, who here can secure all 175 quote unquote fully fledged services in AWS? And no one raises their hand. I certainly don't raise my hand, because no one can possibly know all of those services. And then in a multi-cloud environment, you're approximately multiplying that issue by 3. So there's always more to learn.
Exactly. And that goes back to, how do I enable my team? Well, I'm an expert from a Sentinel side. But while I can say I'm an expert at some of the other products, I wouldn't consider myself the top within our team. I have engineers on my team that are experts within a specific technology, maybe within Azure. They're best at deploying WAFs, firewalls, maybe the network side. Maybe I have somebody on the 365 ecosystem who is great with email security. That's their passion. They're experts there, but they can still do all the other stuff. And so if I ever encounter something that I don't know, more than likely they do, because all of us have something that we excel at within the different clouds.
Got it. And specialization is obviously something that's necessary in one of these environments. I am curious, though, of the skill sets that you see that the folks that you work with, the skill sets that you don't have the highest skill in, what's like the next area that you really want to dive deep into and learn more about?
So for me, it's the DevOps side. And I mean, that I went ahead and took the 540, which is the cloud security and DevSec automation, right? So that is my next area that I'm diving into. I mean, I took the 510, dove into a rabbit hole of Terraform, and next thing you know, I'm hooked. I'm doing that for a lot of customers, helping them develop their IAC, and that's my next route. And then same thing with my team. I had their areas where we don't see much of, but we want to dive into it to expand. And I'm letting them, at this point, there's certain areas they want to dive into, and if it fits, go for it. Here's your part of your learning path, and here's kind of where you're going to expand and specialize in other areas.
And to tie that back into the previous conversation, it's got to be something fun, something that they're interested in, or something that you can get them interested in, because, at the end of the day, people are going to learn things that are interesting to them. It's very hard to drag someone to understand something that they are fundamentally not interested in or are even averse to. So it's good that you all have the open mind to allow folks to go into whatever areas they want to. I think that's really, really important. So we're going to have to wrap up soon, but I have to ask you now a little bit about your experience getting involved with SANS, because I'm sure there are some folks who are listening to this podcast who've taken some SANS classes or are about to take their first SANS class, and they check it out, and hopefully they love it as much as I loved it the first time that I checked it out. And they may eventually say, hey, I want to facilitate, or I want to be a TA, or I want to be an instructor or author one day. I'd like to get your perspective of how you got involved with SANS, how it went. Were you intimidated? Was it natural? And what other advice you would give folks trying to go down that same journey?
So I got involved because I was over at IBM Cloud and had to deal with the application whitelisting, and this ran on Windows servers. So I had to administer a lot of Windows servers, do a lot of PowerShell, and harden these systems. So they wanted me to go take the SEC505, which, by the way, is a tough course. It is a lot of information. It is way more information than we did. That's for sure. But if you're going to take a course, just make sure you keep an open mind. You're ready. You're prepared to take notes, have discussions. The biggest thing is if you don't ask questions, you're not. I personally feel that you don't get as much out of it if you're not asking questions. There is no stupid question, because questions start discussions, whether it's an answer from the instructor or maybe somebody in the class might have more expertise in a specific area than the instructor. I'm always having little conversations around Microsoft when we do the SEC510, but enjoy it, ask questions. And then if you want to pursue it further, I love the whole facilitator piece. My first class was not as a facilitator, but the facilitator in that class is the one that got me onto the work study program, and how beneficial it is because of the perks, the ability to meet other TAs, other facilitators, actually get to interact a little bit more with the instructors as they show up the day before, and learn about others' experience with other classes. And now I've been doing that when it comes to the work study, don't get down if you're not selected. Just keep applying for the ones that you are going to be available for. Also, if you have an employer, make sure that they're aware that you're trying to do these things. That's one thing I was very transparent with, my employer, as you got me hooked. You sent me to one class. I want to do more. Here's where you're having me go down the cloud route. So I said, I have a learning path for SANS that I've provided them, that changed a little after I got really hooked on wanting to be an instructor for the 510. So that shifted since, but mainly be transparent with them and let them know what you're interested in and how that benefits the company, right? And that, there's this work study, you get it cheaper, and, you get to learn a lot. You get to bring that expertise back and apply it day one. I know we all hear it from all the instructors. Hey, all this gets to be applied day one, but it's true. You can take the knowledge you learn in class and come back and apply it day one. I did that with the SEC505. I did that with the SEC510. I did that with the cloud design one, and I already did that with the DevSec one. Day one, I was able to come back and start applying the knowledge and the skill sets. And if you want to be an instructor, talk to the instructors. Brandon, you've been great. You've, given me advice. All the other instructors, Ken, the Jasons, because there's a couple, and everybody's given different pointers, different, tips on how to better yourself and your soft skills and how to get it, prepare yourself to become an instructor and what to do. And if you like teaching and helping others grow and learn, I think that's a great position to be in and a great opportunity for those that want that. I'm excited.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the kind words. I definitely mention that you're bringing a lot of prestige to your company whenever you get involved with this community. But at the same time, people here are tremendously humble people. We have experts that have done so many incredible things in government or the private sector, folks that have been in the news or have been expert witnesses, and yet at the same time, all these people just really want to help their students and the people that want to get into SANS themselves. We're all here to help each other out. We're stronger together and no one knows everything. So by mentoring someone else, hey, I'm able to learn something from them and we're all going to get better in the end. So I'm really happy to have you as a part of that. And I hope that other people get to work with me in the future in a similar capacity. But before we wrap up, where can we find you online, John?
So you can find me on LinkedIn for sure. So under John Alves, or you can search, for CyberOne Security or CyberOne LLC. You can also find me on Twitter at CyberLowdown.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming here. We already talked a lot about the great SANS resources out there and the great courses. But for those who have not yet visited sans.org/cloud, you got to check it out, see some of our free resources as well as the courses and figure out where you should be investing in next. Figure out your own personal learning plan. So, John, once again, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Brandon. It was awesome. I enjoyed it, and thank you.